Molly Burkhart watched her entire family die around her, and her own husband was orchestrating the murders. In the early 1920s, the Osage Nation of Oklahoma had become the wealthiest people per capita on Earth. Oil had been discovered beneath their reservation land in 1897, and by the new decade, millions of barrels were flowing from Osage territory. The tribe received quarterly royalty payments that made even the poorest among them rich by the standards of the day. They drove Pierce Arrow automobiles. They built mansions. They sent their children to the finest schools. But something else was happening in Osage County, something that wouldn't fully surface for decades, something that would eventually expose one of the most systematic campaigns of murder in American history. The Osage weren't just wealthy, they were targets. Under federal law, their oil headrights could not be sold, but they could be inherited. And that single legal provision would transform the rolling Oklahoma prairie into a killing field. White businessmen, ranchers, and drifters flooded into the territory. Many came for legitimate opportunity. Others came with darker intentions. They understood that marrying an Osage woman or befriending an Osage man could be worth a fortune if that person happened to die. In May 1921, the decomposed body of Anna Brown was discovered in a ravine near Fairfax, Oklahoma. She had been missing for a week. When they found her, the back of her skull had been blown apart by a bullet. The local coroner examined the body and ruled that Anna Brown had died from drinking too much whiskey. A bullet wound to the head, somehow overlooked. It was an absurd conclusion, and it set the pattern for everything that would follow. Anna was Osage. Anna was wealthy, and Anna was now dead, her headright flowing to her surviving family members. Anna's sister Molly Burkhart was devastated. She demanded answers. She hired private investigators when local authorities showed no interest in pursuing the case. But the investigators either came up empty or quietly left town. Some of them turned up dead themselves. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Asking questions about dead Osage was dangerous work. What Molly didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the conspiracy ran closer to her than she ever suspected. Within 2 years, Molly Burkhart had lost nearly everyone she loved. Her mother, Lizzie Q, died in 1921 under circumstances doctors attributed to a wasting illness. Her sister Minnie died shortly after. Then Anna. Each death concentrated more headrights among fewer survivors. Molly herself began experiencing mysterious symptoms. She was tired constantly, confused, losing weight. Her husband, Ernest Burkhart, seemed attentive and concerned. He brought her medicine, watched over her carefully, made sure she took her treatments. He was slowly poisoning her with insulin. The Burkhart's marriage had been arranged by Ernest's uncle, William K. Hale, a powerful rancher known throughout the region as the King of the Osage Hills. Hale had cultivated relationships with the Osage for years, presenting himself as their friend and protector. He attended their ceremonies, learned their customs, loaned them money, all while methodically positioning his nephew to marry into a family whose headrights he intended to steal. The scope of what was happening in Osage County was becoming impossible to ignore, yet local authorities seemed determined to look away. But then came an explosion that would change everything. On March 10, 1923, a blast tore through the night in Fairfax, the home of Bill and Rita Smith. Rita, being another of Molly's sisters, had been destroyed by a bomb. The explosion was so powerful it was heard miles away. Bill Smith survived the initial blast, but died shortly after. Rita and their servant Nettie Brookshire were killed instantly. This was no subtle poisoning or staged suicide. This was dynamite. This was terrorism. And finally, people outside Oklahoma began to pay attention. The bombing made national headlines. The Osage Tribal Council, desperate after years of inaction from local law enforcement, appealed directly to the federal government. They had buried too many of their people. They had watched too many investigations go nowhere. They needed outside help, someone beyond the reach of the corruption that had consumed Osage County. Their plea would eventually reach the Bureau of Investigation, the young agency that would later become the FBI. But understanding why it took so long requires examining just how deep the complicity ran. The murder of Osage citizens wasn't happening despite local law enforcement. It was happening with their active participation. Sheriffs closed cases without investigation. Prosecutors declined to file charges against obvious suspects. Coroners ruled gunshot wounds as accidents and poisonings as natural causes. Evidence disappeared from lockups. Witnesses were intimidated or killed before they could testify. The guardian system made exploitation legal and simple. Under federal law, many Osage had been declared legally incompetent by courts, unable to manage their own finances. White guardians were appointed to oversee their affairs, controlling their access to their own money. Some guardians simply embezzled. Others realized that a dead ward was more profitable than a living one. Undertaker W.W. Whirlwind Soldier would later testify that bodies were routinely buried before families could request autopsies. The dead were put in the ground quickly, their secrets buried with them. Researchers examining the period would eventually discover that at least 605 Osage died between 197 and 193, a mortality rate that defied statistical explanation. The system designed to protect the Osage had become the instrument of their destruction. J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the Bureau of Investigation, saw an opportunity. His agency was young and eager to prove itself. The Osage case offered a chance to demonstrate federal law enforcement capability while generating positive headlines. He assigned Agent Tom White to lead the investigation. White was a former Texas Ranger who understood the frontier mentality of Oklahoma. He knew that sending obvious federal agents into Osage County would accomplish nothing. Witnesses would clam up, evidence would vanish, and the Bureau would leave empty-handed like everyone before them. So he tried something different. White assembled a team of undercover operatives who infiltrated the county posing as cattlemen, oil prospectors, and insurance salesmen. They spent months building relationships, gathering intelligence, and slowly mapping the web of conspiracy that had claimed so many Osage lives. They traced money, tracked relationships, and listened to the whispers that locals shared when they thought no one important was paying attention. Every thread they pulled seemed to lead to the same place, a ranch on the outskirts of Fairfax, owned by a man everyone called the King. Ernest Burkhart broke first. Confronted with the evidence the Bureau had assembled, he confessed to his role in the conspiracy and implicated his uncle William Hale as the mastermind behind multiple murders. Hale had ordered the killing of Henry Roan, an Osage man, to collect on a life insurance policy. He had arranged Anna Brown's death. He had orchestrated the bombing that killed the Smiths. Hale was arrested, but convicting him proved difficult. His first trial ended in a hung jury. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. Defense attorneys challenged federal jurisdiction. It took multiple trials before Hale was finally convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. John Ramsey, the hired killer who had pulled triggers and planted bombs at Hale's direction, was also convicted. Ernest Burkhart received a life sentence as well, though Molly, somehow still alive, having survived years of slow poisoning, eventually divorced him. Congress responded to the horror by passing legislation in 1925, barring non-Osage from inheriting headrights from tribal members who possessed more than half Osage blood. It was a belated acknowledgement that the law itself had created the incentive for murder. William Hale was paroled in 1947. He had served just over 20 years for orchestrating a reign of terror that claimed dozens of lives, perhaps hundreds. He returned to Oklahoma and lived out his remaining years in relative comfort. Most of the murders were never prosecuted. Most of the killers were never identified. The true death toll remains unknown, though researchers now believe it may exceed 200 Osage victims. Families still carry the trauma, still tell stories of relatives who died under suspicious circumstances, still wait for an accounting that may never come. The Bureau of Investigation burnished its reputation on the Osage case, pointing to the convictions of Hale and Burkhart as proof of federal competence. But the investigation was incomplete by design. Pursuing every lead, every complicit official, every hired killer would have meant indicting half of Osage County. So the Bureau declared victory and moved on. What happened to the Osage was not a mystery. It was not a secret. It was a systematic campaign of murder enabled by law, protected by authority, and driven by greed. The oil beneath the prairie made the Osage wealthy, and that wealth made them targets in a country that had already taken everything else from them. The reign of terror ended not because justice prevailed, but because the killers got what they wanted, or got caught trying. The dead remain in the Oklahoma earth, most of their murders officially unsolved, their names carried only by descendants who refuse to let the world forget what was done to the wealthiest people in America.